basically introduce and thank Mariela Cohen and Sarah Merrill from Justice for Colombia, based in London. Mariela will be talking about the situation as far as trade unions in Colombia and human rights, but it's also going to cover the current peace talks that are which have been taking place for coming up to a year now in Havana. And one of the things I said at the last session was that, and Mariela explained to you, and Sarah as well, she's about somewhere, will explain to you about the importance of the, in a perverse sort of way, the Northern Ireland dimension to this, because there was a cross-party delegation went out last year, comprising of the UP, the Ulster Unionists at the time, Sinn Féin and the SDLP, along with a number of trade unionists, in order to, it was in order to sort of support and sort of relay the experiences of the Northern Ireland peace process. And if you look at the Justice for Colombia website, you'll see a photograph of the FARC representatives in Havana, along with Jeffrey Donaldson, Colin McDevitt, Conor Murphy, and John McAllister from now Northern Ireland NI 21. And a few years ago, who would have thought that you'd have unionist politicians smiling with their T-shirts and casuals with Ivan Marquez and whoever else from the FARC negotiating team. So there's an important role that we can play, in particular importance in supporting Justice for Colombia and the work they're doing in trying to support a genuine peace process. And I know a lot of the stuff that we've heard about Colombia in the past has been focused primarily, if not exclusively, on breaches of human rights, assassination and murder of trade unionists and peasant leaders and other community leaders. So I'll not say any more. I'll hand you over to Mariela. I think Sarah might want to make a few comments as well. Sarah is the parliamentary person for Justice for Colombia. She does the contacts with political parties and the political representatives. So over to you, Mariela.
I'm not sure how much background people have, but I'm going to start with the trade union situation. And you've probably heard that Colombia is the most dangerous place in the world to be a trade union activist. About 60% of all trade unionists killed in the world are Colombian. And this is in the context of an armed conflict and a political conflict which has been taking place for almost 60 years between the government and the FARC, the left-wing insurgency, and the ELN, which is a smaller guerrilla organisation. In the 80s, this was more complicated by the creation of the far-right paramilitary groups, which were created by the state, by the military, in collusion with business and landowners as a counterinsurgency strategy, really. And the paramilitaries have carried out some of the more sort of dirty war tactics against anyone, really, who organises, not just against the guerrillas, in fact, hardly at all against the guerrillas, more against civil society organisations, people they deem to be guerrilla collaborators or people that would be sympathetic with guerrillas, and the unions fall into that category. And the conflict in Colombia, despite what people say in the media about it being about drugs, the drugs issue only came into being really in the 70s. The conflict really is about inequality and about political exclusion, and there's never been, the opposition has never been able to operate without being met with violence. The level of inequality in Colombia is such that you have the third highest level of inequality in the world, the highest in Latin America, and 60% of land is owned by 1% of the population. And there's a huge levels of inequality. We always say to people, if you were in a trade union meeting like this in Colombia, half of you probably wouldn't be here. Some of you would leave this room and, leading activists would have bulletproof jeeps waiting outside. You'd have bodyguards. You'd never be able to walk. We have a lot of colleagues who never walk down the street in Colombia ever. And that's the daily reality for Colombian trade unionists. Your children are threatened. Your partners are threatened. You get funeral wreaths delivered to your office. It's just a constant intimidation. And that's what they have to battle against. And it's for nothing more than doing what you do every day, for representing your members, for organising, for asking for collective bargaining, for defending public services. It's all those issues. This year we've had around 30 activists killed, and they're killed by the state security forces and by the paramilitaries, in the majority, the paramilitaries. There's been 37 human rights defenders killed in the first 6 months of this year already. And the Colombian government, when you talk to them about the trade union killings, a few years ago, before they got more savvy with their PR, they'd say, oh, but trade unions are linked to terrorists. Now they know better than to say that, but what they'll argue is that trade unionists aren't killed because of their trade union activity. It's just crime or crimes of passion. You hear that trade unionists are drinkers and cheaters and they get involved in all sorts of things, and that's why they end up dead. But actually you can see a correlation between the trade union activity and the murder. You see the people that end up being killed have had a history of death threats or are leading industrial action or involved in some sort of dispute. This violence has led to a situation where you only have 3% of the workforce organised in a union. Obviously, there's a lot of fear about being involved in a union, but also there's issues that you face here every day about agency workers and informal contracts and all sorts of anti-union legislation that also makes it hard to organise in a union. The other issue you have is you have a huge informal sector of workers made up by displaced people that have come from the countryside, forced off their land to the cities, and the displaced population in the majority are women and children. So women make up the majority of the informal sector, working as domestic cleaners or as selling things on the street, and they're obviously completely unprotected and very vulnerable positions. I wanted to give you some examples, and again, it's not just trade unionists who are targeted, it's journalists, it's lawyers that defend trade unionists, it's environmental activists, members of the opposition. And just to give you a few personal examples to give you an idea of the type of people. So this is just all in the last couple of weeks. On Sunday, just last Sunday, a man called Sergio Perdomo, who's a peasant leader from Caloto, which is a village in southwest Colombia that Brian actually visited last year. He was murdered in front of a whole community, and he is the leader of a displaced community of 179 families that were forced off their land by paramilitaries, and they're living in a sort of made-up shelter at the moment, and men came in and shot him in front of them, many children, just on Sunday. On Monday this week, 2 men killed a 53-year-old agriculture worker leader, Roberto Cortes, who's a member of a mass opposition movement called the Patriotic March. He was stopped on the street and shot, and he died later that day. On November the 2nd, 37-year-old Cesar Garcia, an environmental activist, he was shot dead in front of his wife and his 8-year-old son. And he had been organising in opposition to a mega mining project that the South African multinational Anglo Gold Ashanti is trying to implement in the region, which the community are heavily against. And for that he was killed. And that happens, we get these coming in every day, every couple of days, just constant. Sorry. And these people are fighting for social justice. Colombia is a country that has huge wealth. It's not a poor country in terms of resources. It has gold, oil, minerals, amazing fertile land, water resources, all sorts of resources. And the neoliberal model has been imposed in Colombia through violence, through terror. We take delegations over to Colombia, and you see trade unionists and politicians seeing the sort of sharp end of the model that some of the politicians are defending. You see that in Colombia, but in the most stark, brutal way that it's been implemented. And there's been this perverse backwards land reform where people have been shoved off their land. You've had 5 million people had their land stolen, have been pushed off their land. There's been 10 million hectares of land stolen by paramilitary groups, which has then gone through a legalised process and ended up in the hands of, in the majority, multinational companies and large landowners. So there's a very difficult situation there for people that are organising. There's also, been things that are happening here in terms of austerity and privatisation. It's been a sort of guinea pig model in Colombia, and there's a lot also. It's not just about showing support for Colombia, but also learning about, how people have been organising around those issues. The Colombian government in the last few years has focused heavily on securing free trade agreements. There's been ones with the US, with Canada, now with the EU. The last name on that list, the last trade unionist to be killed last year, was an oil worker who was shot dead 2 hours after the European Parliament approved the EU-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. And these trade agreements have been, there was a battle. I mean, there was big campaigns. We ran a campaign in the EU. It's coming to Westminster next week, and Sarah's going to talk a bit about our struggle to get the Labour Party to oppose it. But we've had, in the US there was a big campaign, in Canada there was a campaign, and it was stalled for several years on human rights and labour grounds. And Obama and President Santos, the Colombian president, signed what they called the Labour Action Plan in order to get it through, where the Colombian government signed up to all sorts of promises. And last week in the US Congress, 2 Democrat congressmen who were in Colombia to observe the situation said, this has been a failure, it's not been implemented. But the Colombian government is extremely sophisticated in its PR. It's very, very clever and well advised by the US, by Britain. And they invest millions in their public relations image in the international community. The irony is, over the summer, there was the biggest industrial action you've seen for over 20 years in Colombia. We had 400,000 people out on the streets blockading the roads. It was a national agricultural strike, and then all sorts of other sectors joined the strike in protest at the impact of the free trade agreements. What has happened is that peasant farmers have been left devastated by the imports of subsidised goods from Canada and now the US. The reaction of the Colombian government to those strikes was to shoot dead 16 activists during the strikes. It wasn't just arbitrary random violence. There was, people using snipers to target specific activists. There was 800 people rounded up and arrested. One of the leaders of the strikes, who was a negotiator nominated for the agricultural workers, Uber Ballesteros, who's a close friend of ours, he was due to address the TUC conference in Brighton in September, and he was in prison just a week before he was due to come here, and he was accused of rebellion and financing terrorism. And that is the charge that's used against any trade unionist or other activists that's in prison and kept in really horrendous conditions. I was in Colombia just over the weekend, and I went to visit him on Friday, and even to get into the prison, it's a battle. It's a month of lobbying and pressuring and threatening with MPs and all sorts of things to try and get in. And he's been held in a maximum security wing, never gets to see daylight. It's just a closed thing the entire time. He's been refused the diet he needs because he's diabetic. You've got, no toiletries, awful, tiny food rations, no healthcare. And this is the situation that hundreds and hundreds of people find themselves in, but you will never hear the British government recognising that there's political prisoners in Colombia. It's impossible. Just to give you some of the... And that's one thing I always say, that the victory in Colombia hasn't been a military one, because they haven't had a military victory, but they've had a propaganda victory internationally, and that's what we, try and expose on a daily basis. To give you some of the statistics, just the level of the crisis, I said 5 million people have been displaced, 50,000 people have been forcibly disappeared in recent years. The current president, he was formerly the Minister of Defence in the previous administration, and you saw some of the mothers in the film. What they're talking about is a process whereby soldiers received bonuses and promotions for every dead guerrilla that they would hand in to show, the war effort is working. And 3,000 young people were killed in that way. So the army would set up false recruitment agencies in shanty towns, offer young men jobs, take them to the countryside, execute them, dress them in a FARC uniform and say, oh, look, and claim their 3 days off and roast chicken, down to that crude level. And that's the president we have, who is lauded as the most democratic Latin American leader, close friend of Tony Blair, the man of peace. And I've talked about some of the other issues. This weekend, I was at a congress of the opposition party, which has just regained its legal status after suffering the first case recognised at the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights as political genocide, when almost 5,000 party activists were killed, 2 presidential candidates, most of them members of Congress, and this was carried out by the military intelligence in the 80s and 90s. But we're always very careful to show that people do organise and resist, and it's not just, we don't want people to just feel sad and feel sorry for Colombians. The fact is people are organising. There's a huge new opposition movement called the Patriotic March. It's a coalition of over 2,000 organisations, trade unions, peasants, indigenous, students, and they have been pushing for the last years for a peace process which delivers social justice, which addresses the root causes of the conflict. And that's something that JFC, Justice for Colombia, has been working on. We've been asked by the unions and by the movements there to support the peace talks and to make sure that this peace process isn't just, a demobilisation process, but actually a peace process which delivers the sort of change that Colombia needs. The peace talks started in November last year between the FARC and the Colombian government. The ELN is not yet in peace talks, but there's rumours that that is going to come very soon. We looked at Northern Ireland because we know that President Santos has been advised by Jonathan Powell, who was obviously heavily involved in the Good Friday Agreement for many years, and he's been very closely looking at what happened here as a bit of a model, and we felt it was important to build a cross-party group, not just to support the Colombian government, but to support the peace process as a process and to support civil society's demands, which are for a ceasefire, because you've got a situation where you've got negotiations taking place in Havana, but you've got no ceasefire in Colombia, so war is raging in Colombia, which isn't conducive to, a successful outcome, and also the humanitarian cost is huge. Also to push for civil society involvement in the peace process and to push for guarantees for peace activists, because you have talks in Havana and then on the ground you have the same level of repression and smearing of anyone as opposition as terrorists. So we've built this group with the help of NIPSA, Unison, Unite, other unions of cross-party politicians from the DUP, other unionist parties, Sinn Féin and the SDLP, and we took this delegation with Brian and some other trade unionists as well to Colombia last November. It had a huge impact. They addressed the Senate and the House of Representatives. It was all broadcast live on television. To have a Sinn Féin and a DUP politician standing together talking about, they actually came around those key messages. They did come together around those, and it had a big impact there. They met with the president. We arranged for them to meet with the president and his negotiators, and they gave them over an hour to discuss, how things move forward here. And in June, we took them to meet the FARC in Havana, and it was, a difficult thing to do in the sense that the FARC are considered, terrorists on the EU list, and it was the first delegation to meet the FARC from the international community in over 12 years. But we felt it was important to make it clear that this can't just be about supporting the government. This has to be about supporting the peace process as a whole. And for that, the parties at the table need to be treated as equal partners, and there needs to be access to the international community for all sides. So that was, again, very, very powerful to have, a former member of the IRA, a former member of the army sitting together talking to the FARC and doing it in an open, public way. We're now trying to take that group to Washington to do lobbying in Washington, because the US, is the biggest funder of the war. It needs to get behind the peace process, and to also build pressure on the Colombian government that this peace process can't just be about the president's vision for peace. This has got to be a peace process which addresses the root causes, and that's a constant tension at the table. There's a constant restriction from the government negotiators about what is going to be negotiated. They say the economic model is not on the table. It's not an easy process, and it's fragile. It needs support internationally. But we need, support from people here, from Britain, from Ireland, internationally, really, to try and make this peace process an international issue. It can't just be this hidden thing in Havana. The difference and the reason why we've tried to link it to what happened here is that the US obviously played a very different role here to how they're dealing with Colombia, and we need the conflict in Colombia to get the recognition it deserves. An odd way to put it, but it needs to be recognised as a conflict, and the peace talks need to be recognised as more than just this president who happens to want to, get a Nobel Peace Prize. There's a lot of problems that make the government act very contradictory in terms of the talks. The far right, the military, the former president are not behind him. They're constantly attacking him and trying to push for them to leave the negotiating table. And there's a lot of issues that are making the talks, difficult. But what is in our favour is the level of civil society mobilisation that is behind these talks and pressuring constantly to make that agenda wider and make civil society have a role in it. So I think Sarah's going to talk a little bit more about some of our parliamentary work, but we couldn't do this without the union movement. We're a union campaign. We were founded by the unions. We're funded by the unions, and it's really been you know, a new level of work for us. We've worked for a lot of years on trade union rights, on political prisoners, but the peace issue is the first time we've been able to do something, you know, creative in terms of constructive and actually trying to lead towards a fundamental change. So it's a crucial moment in Colombian history and we need support more than ever. So thank you for giving us this opportunity.
Okay, Sarah?
I was just going to explain a little bit about the parliamentary work that we do. The film explains that the TUC established Justice for Colombia, but now it's owned by the British and Irish trade union movement. And our work, our parliamentary work on a weekly basis, a daily basis, is both in Britain and in Ireland, in Stormont and in the Dáil in Dublin. I'm trying to say that right, somebody corrected me a little while ago. We started formalising a parliamentary group in Westminster in about 2008, a bit before, but now we have over 80 members of the Commons sort of officially signed up to that, and we have many peers as well, members of the House of Lords. It started off as a Labour group. Labour was in power, and I was partly responsible for being a bit party political about that. We've broadened it out more recently, largely with the help of our work actually here in Stormont. With the peace, we now have a parliamentary group in Stormont which is completely cross-party, largely because of our work over recent years for the peace process. And the commitment by the politicians, both the MPs, the Northern Ireland MPs and the MLAs at Stormont has just been phenomenal, really, and that has really helped to open it out. So the DUP, Jim Shannon, Geoffrey Donaldson, I was saying to the previous group, Jim Shannon's one of our biggest biggest supporters. Every Foreign Office questions, Jim Shannon is the one who's standing there asking the Foreign Secretary or the Minister, Hugo Swire, questions about human rights in Colombia and about trade unionists and about deaths of trade unionists. Geoffrey's fairly good as well, of course Sinn Féin, but they're not in the chamber. And that's helped to bring on board a couple of more Conservatives and a couple more Liberal Democrats, and of course we have the Green MP, so it's broadening out. And the reason that's important is because whatever our political views, and I understand that a lot of people don't view the Labour Party as particularly left, and I might share that view, but nonetheless, we have to broaden it out because if we're going to make mileage on the international stage with this, it can't be seen to be a campaign just of the left. And the support that comes from the right of centre parties is enormously valuable in that respect. 2 years ago, over 2 years ago, we brought the leaders of Colombians for Peace to an all-party meeting in Stormont in the Senate chamber, and we took them down to Dublin, and we took them to Westminster, and we did the same this year with the leaders of the Patriotic March. And the meeting that we had down in Dublin, the best meeting we had was a Fine Gael TD who's very supportive of us, who brought 11 Fine Gael TDs to a meeting to meet the Patriotic March. So this is sort of enormously powerful, and also the internationalism of it. It's not just Britain, it's Britain and Ireland. And those are two major players in the European Union. And that helps us enormously too. So the support that we have from the whole of Ireland, both Stormont, both the MLAs, both the MPs, and down in Dublin has moved our whole campaign on enormously. And Mariela alluded just now to the fact that we're battling at the moment. The free trade agreement is going through Westminster. It's a statutory instrument, it's secondary legislation, it has a small committee hearing, and then it has deferred voting. And we've been campaigning for years to get the Labour Party, we don't expect the Conservatives to do so, they'll vote in favour, but to get the Labour Party to vote in opposition to this. And we've worked it, and now we're told they'll go as far as abstaining. So there might be some movement, they might vote no in committee, but it's, you know, it is a constant battle, and a lot of bigger support, more support comes from other, you know, not into the backbench parliamentary party, you know, a lot, big swathe, 50 MPs completely loyal to us, but the front bench, it's a bit of a more difficult story, and we get a lot more support from front bench from other parties sometimes. Anyway, that's our story.